now we have quite a bit of time for discussion. I don't see any questions right now in the chat. Oh, just one came in right now for Anya. Not sure who it is, but I'm just going to read it out. He cited Revelation 1:15 as a source of the astral body sounds of the cricket, mumblebee, flute, harp, gong, and ocean roar. Was he trying to connect these internal sounds to a biblical reference, which I believe refers to the sound of Jesus' voice as a sound of rising water instead of a Haṭhayoga text?
So yes, for sure, right? And this is something that he does quite often. I've actually found a bunch of interesting instances of this in looking at the way that he handles Kundalini, where, I mean, he never mentions any kind of medieval texts, right? It's all about like Moses lifting up the serpent in the wilderness and, Jesus telling you to go forth and be wise as serpents and stuff like that. I mean, I think some of this is a little bit gimmicky, right? It's speaking to the cultural references that his audiences would have been familiar with. You might have noticed at the end of the Om poem that I just showed there, he like sort of once this all reaches essentially the crown chakra, right? He calls this the Christmas symphony. I don't think he's talking about Christmas in the sense of like, the holiday with Santa Claus. This idea that Christ, right, is kind of synonymous with higher consciousness is everywhere for him. So I think again, a lot of it is about kind of cultural bridges. But I think also we need to take him seriously on some of this. Obviously, Christianity was a very powerful influence in his work. I think he's very serious in the way that he sort of incorporates these references. When he says that Jesus appeared to him multiple times throughout his life, I think probably Jesus appeared to him multiple times throughout his life. And so, yeah, I think you find this kind of very interesting referencing that accomplishes these kind of various goals, right? Some of which are about his audience and what they think or what he thinks they need to hear. How do you establish authority, right? Amongst a whole bunch of Protestant Christians, effectively. But some of it is also him genuinely trying to build this kind of intercultural synthesis.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes. So I think Seth, you do have a question for Anya, I believe, right?
I do, but I think there's another one that just came in the Q&A box from a participant, so maybe we can take that first.
Oh, sure, I missed that one. Just a second. Yes. Hello, I've noticed that the ultimate goal of the Kriya Yoga, Purna Kriya, is for the inner sound to arise naturally and to be ever present within the practitioner, which seems to be almost identical as the Powell lineage practices' ultimate goal. Is the source of Kriya and Powell practices somehow connected?
So I have not tried to trace these connections very precisely. Let me begin with that. But my educated guess is that absolutely. In fact, you have some references to Sri Yukteswar, Yogananda's guru, as he is sort of formalizing and institutionalizing a bunch of this stuff in Bengal. Bowel traditions are a really important influence for him. I mean, we see that in some of the biographical material reference specifically. So it's kind of these vague references. It's not really clear exactly kind of what came from where. But even from a kind of, like swimming in the same cultural water standpoint. Yeah, I mean, he's hanging out in Bengal, right? So, like, insofar as he would have been in conversation with a bunch of other practitioners, I think that bowel communities would have been an important piece of that.
Wonderful, thank you. Seth, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for Anya that's somewhat related to that and perhaps the Bengali context, which is just about the mantra being haṃ-sa rather than haṃsa or so hum in the Sanskrit. So I'm just curious, I don't know, is that because of Yogananda's like Calcutta and Bengali heritage or how he learned it from his guru? Are there discussions about why he teaches it as haṃ-sa rather than, the Sanskrit? And then if you know, like among practitioners today, is there any anxiety or discussions about why are we pronouncing it like this? I mean, I think for yoga practitioners, this is a big thing, right? We want to pronounce the terms correctly. There's a lot of emphasis placed on that within the traditions, right? So yeah, anything you can offer about why it's haṃ-sa.
Yeah. Well, and that, again, that was again just my best educated guess, right? Is that it's like the Bengali creeping in. I don't know ultimately. There's no discussion of this. Um, I mean, I think that so Seth, you're absolutely right that there's this emphasis on pronouncing things correctly, um, at least in theory. But hanging out in the yoga spaces that I do, they don't care. I mean, if I could tell you like the various permutations of basic Sanskrit terms that I hear on a daily basis, and there's no anxiety about this. I used to actually occasionally approach teachers and like not correct them, but ask like, well, why do you pronounce it this way? Like, where did you learn that? And usually the response is that, like some teacher somewhere used to pronounce it this way, and that was just how they've always pronounced it. And so these specific forms of these words, usually anglicized Sanskrit, right, I think are kind of passed down through their own very interesting parampara. Um, and people actually are often attached to the way that they've learned to pronounce things more so than having some sort of correct Sanskrit pronunciation. When they encounter the correct Sanskrit pronunciation, their response is often like, but it doesn't feel like that's not how I learned it. It doesn't feel authentic to me. And so I can't really speak to whether or not there's any kind of anxiety within the SRF community about how Yogananda anglicized some of this stuff. I'm not part of the SRF community, so I don't know. I'm not an ethnographer. But I would bet that for the majority of them, it probably looks very much like what I encounter in kind of postural yoga spaces, where like this is the way that they learned it, right? Yogananda was Bengali. This is how he said it. There's this cute story about somebody trying to tell him that Yogoda is not like proper Sanskrit. And I mean, essentially, he shrugs and is like, okay, but it sounds good. So yeah, I think that's not a very satisfying answer probably to your question, but it's sort of what I tend to see.
Thank you. Yes, I see one more question in the audience from Beatrix Hauser. Thank you for your inspiring presentation. You mentioned that the practices today differ from 1920. I did not really get in what sense. If you could explain.
Oh, I'm not sure exactly what that's referring to. So maybe in the sense that if I said something that sounded that way, I likely meant it in kind of as Yogoda being marketed as its own thing. I mean, today you can definitely still obtain all these lessons from the SRF, but they're really considered to be preparatory for Kriya Yoga. Whereas in the 1920s, this is what Yogananda first developed and kind of publicized, in terms of his just public facing teachings as this sort of guru on the American stage. There was no expectation, as far as I could tell, that, anybody who received these Yogoda lessons would kind of go on to become any more closely associated with Kriya Yoga. They really were meant to be a self-contained system, that you could only do that, right? And that would be great. Whereas today, the energization exercises are treated a little bit more as like a stepping stone to Kriya. Maybe that's kind of what was going on there.
Great, thank you. If I may abuse my role as a moderator here, I'd like to ask you both what do you think is the connection? Because the previous panel was very illustrative as well of the unstruct, but also, of course, unspoken sound, right? Not audible with the physical ear, so to speak. And then in your paper, Seth, but also in Yogananda's idea of the haṃsa, right, is also about sort of unaudible, unspoken, with the physical ears connection. So I'd like you to just reflect on this historical continuity in both practices that have, of course, their difference as you have shown, but there seems to be a continuity at least on that level. So if you could comment, and perhaps we can start with Seth this round.
Yeah, I was thinking about this a bit when I was watching the previous panel, which was more on nada and the unstruck and subtle sounds, that are said to arise from yogic practices. And of course, within the Hatha Yoga texts, we do get these descriptions of nada or nada anusandhana, the concentration on these inner sounds. But they're not always presented in relationship to what I was talking about, this specific unpronounced or ajapā mantra, the soham haṃsa mantra. They're usually in different sections of the text, or not kind of cohesively presented together as a single practice or theory. However, in the haṃsa Upanishad, this Upanishad that is named after this mantra, that's exactly how it's presented. Actually, the haṃsa mantra is done, actually involving, after doing this prāṇāyāma of this ascent of the breath through the chakras, and then there's this kind of conscious repetition of the haṃsa mantra. And then it leads to this progression of the 10 nadas or sounds within this mind-body soundscape of the yogi, from kind of gross to more and more subtle sounds. So in that text, they're presented together and kind of leading towards this inner nada. But I think there's something else going on, which is that there's within the Hatha Yoga texts, and again, I'm looking at these texts not because they're representative of all yoga practice, but they tell us something specific that these, authors were doing at that time when they were trying to bolster and promote this Hatha Yoga tradition. And again, we have to really see it in context of there's a competitive marketplace for different yogas. I mean, not so unlike today. And the Hatha Yoga authors are sort of explaining why Hatha Yoga is efficacious and why you should. And clearly they're doing that because they feel a certain tension. They feel that they need to defend themselves against some of these other competing yoga systems, especially, I think, with the rising kind of influence of Vedanta and other kind of Raja yoga traditions that say, you don't really need to do all these practices. You can just attain this special type of knowledge, recognize the nature of oneself as Brahman, and poof, everything else is taken away. Whereas the Hatha Yogis say, no, you do need to purify the body and the mind and work with the prana, and here are the means to do that. So I think mantra is being kind of interpreted within all of that context. So I think there's this shift that's happening, this move that's not unique to Hatha Yoga. We see this throughout the Indian traditions of this kind of internalization of external things, all the way back to the Upanishads, taking the external ritual sacrifice and interiorizing that with the inner fire of the body. We see that happening with mantras. Instead of the external Om Namah Shivaya, it's the internal Om Japa. So I think that's the kind of yogification of mantras that we see in Hatha Yoga. Now, that doesn't explain what is happening today, but I think it tells us kind of about what was happening kind of in the medieval and early modern periods.
Yeah, thank you, Seth, for chipping in. I'd like to invite perhaps Anya to think also or to share about what was the context of Yogananda. There were, of course, the yogic marketplace at the time. You had Rama Tirth, who was also expounding on Soham, for example, and Shivananda as well. So there was kind of a circuit of gurus at the time who were reaching out to the West, as you also show in your presentation, that perhaps try to strip away sectarian markers and to appeal to more kind of universalistic discourse. And you showed as well, like new religious movements, that try to, have this universalistic discourse that's perhaps more, yes, accessible to a wider audience. So perhaps, do you think this fits a little bit into why Soham was a particularly good fit in kind of this discourse, or perhaps another mantra could have worked as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think my suspicion is that, like, yes, absolutely, it's true that Yogananda is competing, on his own kind of like marketplace. Um, what's interesting about his work, though, is that, I mean, he's clearly aware of all these other figures that are out there. He doesn't tend to spend a lot of time kind of discussing competing methods and saying like, well, here's why we do this, but we don't do that. Um, it's a very common thing that I found in the work of other figures. I mean, Vivekananda did this all the time. Um, but Yogananda, not so much. And I, to some extent, wonder if it's because, like, for him, everything always does seem to come back to this lineage, right? To Kriya Yoga, to this particular method that he was first introduced to when he was 13 years old. Um, at least in my eye, and maybe, I mean, I'm subjective on this, obviously, right? Because I've been just staring at Yogananda's stuff for the last 15 years at this point. But there does seem to be something maybe not unique, but sort of unusual, at least, when compared to the other to his competitors at the time, in the way that he really, like, ultimately does come back to this lineage that he's part of, rather than trying to sort of always like market something against a set of competitors. That's not to say that he isn't also really good at marketing. And you definitely see that in the way that he kind of absorbs some of these other practices and the way that he kind of articulates this Kriya Yoga lineage, even through Christian language, for instance. So the example that I gave with the energization exercises, I mean, it's not even like kind of a new thought, right? It's this very specific style of physical culture spiritualized physical culture that would have been practiced by essentially middle-class women who were kind of his primary demographic. And so as soon as they saw that, they would have known exactly what they were looking at, right? And he kind of absorbs this stuff, right? And transforms it into something else, which is a technique that I think he uses a lot. That's kind of his way of, playing the market. On the other hand, again, I think there is just this sort of like very firm basis in this tradition that he had been practicing at that point for certainly his entire adult life. And so you really kind of get the sense that, like, well, why is he using Soham or haṃ-sa? It's because it's within that first Kriya, right? I mentioned that there's this sort of chanting of seed syllables, and you see different ones within, kind of if you look at the broader texts that are available within the tradition. But at that stage, chanting Soham is very, very common as a kind of basic way of moving prana through the body. And so, I think it's really this basis in the practice itself. It's this kind of living tradition that he was trying to very specifically translate.
Wonderful. Thank you. And talking about bija mantras, there's another question in the chat for Seth this time. Thank you for the presentations and organizing this conference. This question is for Seth. Could you elaborate a little more on the incorporation of mantras or bijas into pranayama practices in Hatha Yoga traditions?
Yeah, thank you so much, Macarena. Hi, thanks for the question. There's really not so much. It was sort of the point that I'm making, actually, is that if we're looking exclusively at the so-called Hatha Yoga corpus, these Sanskrit texts from around the 12th to the 17th or so century that emphasize, the methods of what's called Hatha Yoga. The point that I was making and kind of echoing Mallinson and Singleton is that by and large, there's actually very little mantra that is taught at all in these Haṭhayoga texts is perhaps somewhat surprising. There are a few mentions here and there, but typically mantra within the context of these treatises is not viewed very favorably. But rather than throwing the or the mantra baby out with the bathwater, I think it's getting kind of recycled and reinterpreted. And I see that happening within these prāṇāyāma sections of the Haṭhayoga texts. And in particular, when mantra is taught in the Haṭhayoga texts, it tends to be the ajapā mantra. So rather than the voiced, traditional deity-specific and tradition-specific mantras, it's this kind of yogic mantra of the breath. So I think if we look outside of this strict literary context of these Haṭhayoga treatises, we can see all types of other things. I mean, if you look more broadly in the tantras, you're going to find different types of maybe meditational or more broadly yogic practices involving mantras and bijas and this kind of nyasa practice of inscribing seed syllables, bijas, or sacred syllables onto the body in all kinds of interesting ways. Typically more in I would say, a ritual context than a yoga one specifically. So you see all kinds of different ritual religious practices involving mantras and bijas once we get beyond the strict Hatha Yoga corpus. But within that, I'm kind of emphasizing that I think there's something interesting happening within pranayama. And to Borayin's question and point that there's this kind of internalization and soundless breath component to this that's being internalized for these Hatha yogis. So hopefully that answers your question a bit.
Sure, great. Do we have any open questions? So perhaps the question would be, why do we chant mantras today? Yoga.
Yeah.
And I think,
Probably more for reasons that I think Anya was describing than because these Hatha Yoga texts, because of what they're saying. However, I think, and Anya, I wonder what you think about this, even though Yogananda is not maybe directly inspired by these texts, indirectly, conceptually, the teachings he's receiving from his teachers and so on and so forth are coming down, being influenced by this evolution, historical evolution of ideas that I'm trying to trace a bit, how these things are evolving in the texts. So in that way, even though it's not kind of a direct correlation, we can see kind of the history of ideas here, and then see how these things are continuing to be innovated, adapted, how linguistically and culturally things are changing and shifting. And then, of course, with this sort of the explosion of transnational modern postural yoga with all the different branches and styles and lineages, and being that it's mostly an oral tradition, that students are practicing what they were taught by their teachers, that they then passed down and that they then learned in their yoga teacher training programs and then in their postural yoga classes. These things are changing so frequently and so rapidly, I think, these days. So I think why people are chanting mantras in class just has to do more with these modern lineages and teachers and what traditions they're drawing on, and may or may not relate directly to these Sanskrit Hatha Yoga texts. However, indirectly, I think they're still being informed.
Most definitely. I do think so as well, if I may. There is also the whole, just to kind of come back also to Chris's ukulele in Hawaii, right? There's the whole aspect of music and sound that kind of has not been at the center of our discussion today, but I think it does play a very important role in terms of how yogis today shape their identities and relate to music and mantras and the Kirtan festivals and sort of yes, attaching yourself to a particular lineage or a particular form, depending on what's on your Spotify list and so on and so forth. But Anya, I'm sure you also have some concluding thoughts, because that's the last minute.
Borayin. Yeah, I mean, I think Seth, absolutely it's related. I think that to say indirectly is even to sort of like shortchange it a little bit, right? In fact, I think this panel basically grew out of like the Q&A session of your paper at last year's conference, where I think somebody was like, oh, so, but like, what does this look like? And you were like, well, I mean, but I work on text, so this is what it looks like. And I was like, go check out the SRF. I mean, yes, they're not referencing these medieval texts. They're not reading them as far as I can tell. They're reading like the Gita and stuff. But it's a living tradition, right? I mean, that's what a tradition is. It's people practicing stuff. I mean, that's why the texts are being written, because there's somebody out there that's doing at least something that looks like this. So I think absolutely, right? There is a connection to all these medieval texts. But also, I think that, like, insofar as each new instance of a practice is a transformation of it, that's why Yogananda is such an interesting example. Because on the one hand, when you look at Kriya, I mean, it's so medieval in a sense, whether they're referencing the literature or not. That's just what they're doing. But on the other hand, in his work in particular, you do see the way that this stuff evolves when it enters other cultural contexts. And so, yeah, I mean, the title of the panel is Why Do We Chant Yogas, or Why Do We Chant Mantras in Yoga? But most of us have been talking about mantras that aren't actually chanted, right? We've been talking about this unstruck sound. We've been talking about pranayama. We've been talking about stuff where the mantra is actually internalized in a way that maybe makes it more universal, right? I mean, so hum is not really universal. It doesn't mean anything to an American practitioner unless they have this particular kind of, educational background. But the breath is. And I think that's why Yogananda uses the particular technique that he uses that's really all about making it about the breath. That's what Soham means ultimately for him. And so, I mean, we could also certainly talk about, right, like that other kind of mantra that I mentioned, but I think that even without going there, we can certainly see influences of how all this stuff, this interiorization that you were talking about, Seth, how that's sort of been carried forward into modern, including just postural yoga practice today. That's why they talk about the breath the way that they do in a lot of instances.
This has been a wonderful conversation and two wonderful papers. Thank you so much. We're 2 minutes over time. And there's one more question on the chat, but perhaps Seth, you can reach out to Manya and try to answer her question. And otherwise, I'll give it over to Chris. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Borayin, Seth, and Anya. I also should mention that, yes, this did grow out of that conversation at the last Yoga Sadhana, Yoga Darshana, Yoga Sadhana conference. And Borayin, I also wanted to mention, and I forgot to mention, that we asked you to chair this because you're the head of the Mantrams project, the ERC project that is going to be major and is major, as we know. So it's really an honor for us to have you here to facilitate this conversation, and for Seth and Anya to hear a continuation of that discussion here was really a great pleasure for me, and I'm sure for the audience as well. So thank you, all three of you, for that.